When we think of the problems Mexicans and Mexican Americans face in the United States, there are many issues that come to mind. You might think of immigration and families crossing the southern border looking for work while actively avoiding ICE. Your mind might drift to some of the stereotypes of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, which portray them as something less than human, simply a convenient labor tool for whenever the economy is booming. If there is one unifying issue everyone recognizes, though, it is the problem of deportation and the trauma it causes to Mexican immigrants searching for a brighter future. It's ironic then that so few people know about the Mexican Repatriation of the 1930s, otherwise known as the time when the United States carried out mass deportations of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the midst of the Great Depression. To aid our understanding of the Mexican Repatriation, it's best to refer to Francisco E. Valderrama's book, Decade of Betrayal, Mexican Repatriation in the 1930s, which discusses the full scope of the subject. Valderrama accurately tackles the Mexican repatriation by utilizing oral histories, government documents, and archival materials to explain the precursors to the repatriation, the event itself, and its traumatic consequences for the deportees. If we wanted to establish a starting point for understanding the Mexican repatriation in the 1930s, then it would be best to begin in the early 1920s, when a recession shook the United States for a short period. This early recession would be telling, as it would be a smaller-scale version of the Depression to come only a decade later. Valderrama illustrates the significance of this period, explaining how, faced with an excess of workers, repatriation became an acceptable means for getting rid of unwanted aliens. Repatriation was a cheap, effective way of reducing the suddenly bloated, idle workforce. This successful remedy for getting rid of unwanted workers would not be forgotten. For Mexican workers of this period, it was extremely difficult to find work. Some would travel all around America or up and down the state just to find a job that could provide them with the little money that they needed to survive every day. Although many Mexicans had immigrated to the country chasing the golden life that had been sold to them by their friends and family at home, what they found when they got there was nothing less than poverty and despair. And what's more, finding a job that would provide them the basic necessities of life was not the only struggle they faced, as racist and xenophobic Americans who did not want Mexicans in their country made sure to remind them of that fact at every opportunity. A common belief held by many racist and xenophobic Americans before and during the Great Depression was that Mexicans belonged in their own country, and that any person who had illegally entered the United States, known as an alien, should be immediately removed. One of the many outspoken groups on this subject was the National Club of America for Americans. Stationed in San Diego, this club was united under a set of 24 rules, which include such things as opposing the right for undocumented immigrants to work or receive government welfare, and advocating for the halting of immigration from all countries. In a document sourced from the LA County Board of Supervisors decimal file, the club proposed to the board what they called an anti-alien ordinance proposal on August 18, 1938. The proposal itself is split into two sections. The first recommends prohibiting any unnaturalized alien from working in LA County unless no American citizen is available for the work. The second proposal would prohibit any unnaturalized alien from representing a labor union in a dispute. This document echoes the beliefs that many Americans held during the Depression, being that immigrants were stealing all the jobs away from so-called real Americans, and that if the government could just remove these immigrants stealing the jobs, the economy would surely rebound. When discussing the Mexican repatriation of the 1930s, it's important to address a common belief about the deportations carried out in the States. Contrary to popular belief, the Mexican repatriation rarely involved the federal government and was most often executed by local governments at the city, county, and state level, as well as local businesses. Americans had many reasons for repatriating Mexicans, but Valderrama explains that the intent of repatriation was threefold: to return indigent nationals to their own country, in this case Mexico, to save welfare agencies money, and to create jobs for real Americans. One of the many forms of aid provided to immigrants unable to find work or provide for themselves was welfare, whether it be from the government or local charities. Racist Americans during the Depression commonly argued that the Mexican diaspora in the United States was the largest recipient of government welfare, claiming that they made up the largest percentage of those on welfare. Further, racist Americans cited this as reason enough for the repatriation of Mexicans, as they not only took up all the jobs meant for Americans, but the financial assistance as well. These claims, however, could not be further from the truth, as Mexican families had a strong belief in providing for themselves and often viewed welfare or assistance as demeaning. In fact, the statistics on welfare recipients from the Great Depression reflect this belief held by Mexican families, as Valderrama explains that as a rule, they constituted 10% or less of the total number of families on county aid, the county in question being Los Angeles County, which had one of the largest Mexican populations in the United States at the time of the Depression. In situations when Mexican families were either ineligible for aid or unwilling to receive aid, the difficult decision of returning to Mexico was discussed. The families often lamented the idea of repatriation, whether it be a matter of personal honor and parents wanting to be able to provide for their children, or the fact that some of their children had never lived in Mexico and would be leaving behind their only home for one that they had only ever heard of. The influence of children in these family decisions was particularly important, as often their opinions would become the deciding factors in whether or not the family would stay or repatriate. A picture that captures this particular influence is this one, taken by the iconic photographer Dorothy Lang in June 1935, which depicts a Mexican mother holding her child and discussing the prospect of returning to Mexico. Lang includes a quote from the mother in a caption for the photo, where the mother states, "Sometimes I tell my children that I would like to go to Mexico, but they tell me, we don't want to go, we belong here." This picture beautifully captures both the strength of and difficulty faced by Mexican parents during the Great Depression, as they struggled in a country that had promised them comfort and freedom from poverty, but instead resolved to stay for the well-being of their children. As mentioned before, repatriation was rarely carried out by the federal government, and most often was sponsored by local governments and businesses. Another important detail about the Mexican repatriation in the 1930s was the fact that a majority of those who were repatriated left voluntarily. This voluntary repatriation, however, does not refute the fact that Mexicans chose to leave because of intense pressures of local governments and businesses. Further driving this decision was the fact that those who would leave voluntarily would not have to be arrested and formally deported, which would offer the opportunity to return again sometime in the future, as explained by Valderrama. The influence of local government and businesses, however, should not be understated. For example, the LA County Board of Supervisors prevented undocumented immigrants from being employed by purposefully requiring all employers to show proof of their workers' documentation. This was executed with the knowledge that many of the workers in the agricultural and other major industries in LA were Mexicans who had entered the country without documentation. In Detroit, there was a particularly aggressive repatriation effort on the part of the local government, where social workers would often recommend to families that they should return to Mexico, citing the dire situation the families were placed in and their dependency on the state. Additionally, the state of Detroit would regularly deny welfare requests for Mexicans that would provide them direct financial assistance, and instead provided meal tickets which required the families to eat at large public cafeterias. This was purposefully done to demean the families in a public setting. As some families chose to return to Mexico, they were sometimes offered money by local governments or businesses in exchange for repatriation, as well as a fully funded train ride home. One of the many train stations filled with Mexican families bound for Mexico are these two, photographed on January 12, 1932 and March 8, 1932 respectively, sourced from the digital collections of the LA Public Library. The caption of the first photo explains how the families boarded 3 Southern Pacific trains chartered by Los Angeles County, which set aside about $15,000 to aid them in their repatriation. whilst the second photo's caption describes how the repatriation of the Mexican families, which had been cared for by the county welfare departments, was directed by the departments and officials of the Mexican government. These sources illustrate the chaos and tragedy of the repatriation, as once eager immigrants recognized that they must temporarily abandon their dreams of comfort and fortune. While families chose to return to Mexico with hopes of a second chance in the future, it was still an incredibly difficult experience for them, and one that deserves greater attention so that it may be recognized and never repeated. While the Mexican repatriation of the 1930s most definitely reflected the labor crisis of the Great Depression and the lack of available jobs for those throughout the United States, it is essential to stress that the repatriation more truthfully reflected the fear and resentment of Mexican immigrants in the United States. Whether it was the false accusations of Mexicans stealing jobs or welfare from real Americans, or the laws passed and initiatives taken by local governments and businesses to repatriate Mexicans, documents and statistics from the time prove that Mexicans were purposefully targeted as the scapegoat for the Great Depression. By examining 4 primary sources, which included 3 photographs and a letter documenting the reality of Mexicans during the Great Depression, as well as piecing together the story of the repatriation with the help of a secondary source, it is clear that the Mexican repatriation was not just a matter of labor, but a targeted elimination of the Mexican diaspora in the United States. The repatriation was not the first targeted campaign against Mexicans in the United States, and it certainly will not be the last. With knowledge of this event, it is important to look at the issues that Mexicans face today and in the future, and remember that Mexicans and Mexican Americans are not lazy public charges, but rather hardworking and honorable people who wish to participate all the same in the American experiment. If you've made it this far, I want to say thank you for watching this video. This topic is incredibly complex, and I'm aware that I've only scratched the surface of the Mexican repatriation, so if you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend reading Francisco Y. Valderrama's book, Decade of Betrayal, as it provides a mountain of information about the Mexican repatriation that I used when making this video. To wrap up, I wanted to ask a quick follow-up question, and be sure to let me know your response in the comments. Why do you think that the Mexican repatriation of the 1930s is a relatively unknown historical event? And do you believe a similar repatriation campaign could be carried out today? Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.